Good afternoon. This is August 31st, a Monday, so we're right in the middle of our first unit for this fall's American literature class, Identity and Permissions. If you've been keeping track, right, looking at the reading list, our first unit was a selection of essays from Audre Lorde's collection, Sister Outsider. Okay, I listed them up on the course website, and I've put them out accordingly, so you should be aware of them. They're relatively short, so don't be intimidated by them. Most of them, I think, at the longest average around 5 pages, and that's like 5 Kindle pages. Like, we're not talking very immense, long essays. And out of the things we'll read this semester, I would say on a technical level, right, i.e., the craft, like how difficultly phrased and written and masterfully constructed the English language is in these. These are the least complicated, right? On a ideas level, these are perhaps some of the most complex that we'll be talking about, which is actually why I like them to be first. I want us to recontextualize a lot of the lessons we can pull from Lorde throughout this over the course of the semester, especially in relevance to other things we're going to talk about later. I'll be throwing questions up for discussion later that are, hey, like if Lorde was still around right now, or if Lorde was responding to this other thing that we've read, what do you guys think she would say about it? Are there things you think she would change on? Things of the sort, right? It's always interesting to kind of see where our forebears have fall on the kind of scale of how our perception of like social issues change over time, especially with someone like Lorde, who was so visionary in the way that she thought about things. But we'll get even to one example that I, like on a personal level, can focus on and find very interesting to reconsider now. But we'll get to that in one of the readings. The foreword and the introduction, I don't think require very much discussion from me. The reason I suggest them for the book is mostly to give you guys context if you're unfamiliar with Lorde, which is not uncommon. Unfortunately, it's not uncommon. But generally speaking, they'll give you good context for the book. Most of the essays also give you a good context of what the specific rhetorical situation they were written for was, whether they were an essay or a letter or a response to a critique or something of the sort. But the foreword and the introduction will give you some basic info about Lorde, about where these pieces came from, and what you can do with them. Okay. From there, though, let's kind of take a short bit and move through each of the essays and that are signed, and we'll talk a little bit about them. Okay. The first essay that was assigned is pretty early in the book. It's titled "Poetry is Not a Luxury." Right. The reason that I suggest this one for the class in general, right, is that I think this is a bit of thought that a lot of us are subjected to. Like, I know with me coming out of high school before I moved into this as a major, right, and then into a graduate major and so on, I definitely had this conception that poetry was this, like, kind of, like, caviar of words, like exquisite highbrow thing that, like, there was no real accessibility to, right? I got lucky in high school in that I did get exposure to a lot of more contemporary stuff. Spoken word, slam was kind of having a resurgence at the time. There were a bunch of really good ones. I got to meet a couple and go to a couple of readings that were fantastic. And I had friends that were involved in poetry that kind of like helped open the pathway for my understanding, as it were. That being said, I think this is often a very common conception. I don't know about you guys coming out of it, but I know for me, even going into AP English classes at the time, we didn't spend a lot of time on poetry. What we did spend on was the idea of having to really understand prosody, so like meter and form, and what does this mean, and why is this metaphor here, and all those things are important and useful for us to come to grips with. But I don't think setting them as it's an entirely kind of new caliber of language that we must understand in order to work with is necessarily fair. And I think in this essay, Lord kind of posits the idea that putting poetry as this like highest echelon of the ivory tower is a construction of like an oppressive societal norm, right? It's the idea that by putting poetry up there, we take it away from the people who most benefit from having a voice, right? Those who are marginalized, those who essentially don't fit into what she would describe here as the white fathers, which is the wealthy, straight, rich, white kind of controlling class, as it were, in academia and indeed in most of society in a Western sense. So it's definitely interesting, right? She talks about the fact that poetry's been made sterile in those ways, and I think a lot of the way we talk about analyzing poetry, especially for things like AP exams and stuff like that, I have my composition exams coming up, and I feel like it does this too, is we make it very sterile, right? It's very much a clinical unpacking and breaking up of what's going on, rather than a much more loving and in-depth examination of what is it doing to us on a personal level, and what is it doing, how is it speaking to power, what is its value, rather than is it technically the most, the best flex of technical craft. So it's interesting, right? I signed this essay because I think having that idea kind of cracked open, and what a lot of us will feel about poetry examined, and what essentially oftentimes I notice with students essentially equates to an unease or sometimes just general fear when these assignments come up, where I ask you to read poetry and talk about it, and students just don't know, they don't feel comfortable with it, they haven't spent time with it. And that's fair, that's just an artifact of the schooling system. But I think here Lord does a good job of helping unpack that for you guys. There's a couple lines in here that I think are particularly useful for you to think about when you get to your discussion. Very early on, right, she has one paragraph. She says, for example, at this point in time, I believe that women carry within ourselves the possibility for a fusion of these two approaches so necessary for survival, and we come closest to this combination in our own poetry. I speak here of poetry as a revelatory distillation of experience. So it's a really interesting definition to get brought up, right? As she goes on to say, not the sterile wordplay that too often the white fathers distorted the word poetry to mean, in order to cover a desperate wish for imagination without insight, right? So her argument is that, it seems to me at least, to be the idea that she, in the kind of sterilization of poetry and making it all about craft and not about kind of that insight, that deeper meaning, it's a push to remove the power for poetry to say powerful things, right? Which I find very fascinating, right? And then we get essentially the title line right after that, which is, for women, then poetry is not a luxury. It is a vital necessity of our existence, right? Very, very good line. If we skip a little deeper in, right? Another one that I really think is an interesting one to fixate on, right? Especially if you've read the foreword and the kind of introduction, so you have an idea of who Lord is, right? She says, the white fathers told us, I think, therefore I am. The black mother within each of us, the poet, whispers in our dream, I feel, therefore I can be free. Poetry coins the language to express and charter this revolutionary demand, the implementation of that freedom, right? This, I think, is probably the first place we get to where I want to bring up the concept of what I mean by permissions, right? It's very easy to think of, let's call them just like subjects to write about as just, yeah, go for it, right? But I'll run into students a lot of times, especially when I was teaching actual creative writing classes, where I'd be able to sit down with a student and ask them to write a poem, and what you usually get, for example, in high school is just an endless amount of trying but not amazing love poems, right? And a lot of the idea comes from this, is that that's a thing that poetry can be about, right? What we're going to examine in this class is that kind of construction of these are the things that it is okay to write about, or like these are the things that are worth writing about, can be harmful in some ways, right? This kind of prescription from above of like what constitutes subject matter that fixates on high language and high literature, right? How that comes from a place of power, and kind of what Lord is saying here is that, well, if we impose that, right, then we're not giving, we're taking power away from poetry to speak to other things. And I think that what it kind of comes around to, especially in this line, right, poetry coins the language to express and charter this revolutionary demand. The implementation of that freedom is this idea that we can really write about whatever we want to write about, and we should, right? We'll talk later about whether or not it's successful in any particular instance, right? That's a different discussion that has a whole bunch of power dynamics to it we'll get to. But I think Lord here is kind of driving home to the point that we can't let kind of structural impositions of what defines literature take away our opportunity to use that literature to expound on greater truths of experience, right? So here she's talking about from a woman's perspective, and even further from a black woman's perspective, right? And then even further still from a black lesbian woman's perspective. But this is kind of a universally applicable point, I think, and we'll be talking about this throughout the semester. How do things that we've read or will be reading, how do they communicate a particular permission, or how do they open the door for people who come later, or do they explore something that hasn't come before, or do they successfully enough do it that they've kind of made the case for, no, this is absolutely literature, right? We'll talk about that as we go, for sure, but I think this essay does a very good job of kind of laying that out as a series of options, okay? The next essay is titled Notes on Barriers to Women in Loving, right? This, I think, in some ways speaks to a number of things that have actually been mentioned in that first essay. This idea that there is a kind of a barrier to the accessing and then expressing of feeling, right? Or at least some sort of policing of what is acceptable expression of feeling, which is strange. I particularly picked this one up because I think Lord gives us some interesting definitions that we can talk about over the course of the semester here. So right at the start, she gives us her definitions for racism, sexism, heterosexism, and homophobia, right? Which are all very interesting. And I'll let you read them out to yourselves accordingly, right? But think about these, right? When we get to later discussions where how something is set up kind of impose any of these restrictive, problematic schools of thought on what could be art and necessary art for the expression of feeling, right? She describes them as forms of human blindness, which I think is a very apt description, right? It is a blind spot or an inability to see a specific field of humanity or human experience as existence or even having value, which I find very interesting, right? This piece also has a good amount of historical context to it. It is probably the longest essay in the section, maybe edged out by the essay about talking to her son about feminism, which we'll talk about in a second, right? But I find this essay very interesting because it kind of unpacks a general idea that Lord will also bring up in a lot of contexts throughout her essays, and we'll talk a lot about in general, which is an idea that kind of the upliftment and raising of peoples and the access of rights and dignity is not a zero-sum game, right? So this idea that, for example, she talks about this in a couple essays, but a lot of the discourse around the time was this idea that with black women focusing efforts, for example, during the civil rights movement on women's rights, right, there were some black male civil rights leaders that took exception with this under the argument that it was weakening the overall movement. They should focus on racial rights before we focus on gendered rights, right? Similarly, Lord will also talk about, for example, that the white woman's experience, the sharing kind of experiential oppression via womanhood, right, in our society, is not equivalent to, you know, a black woman's existence, or so on and so forth, right? That there are these places that we have intersections, which nowadays we call intersexual identity, but she doesn't use the term, she kind of predates it, right? But that we are an amalgamated bundle of identities that all kind of meet at us, right? So for me, for example, you know, like I'm white, transgendered, queer sexuality, right? Student living in the South in the United States, generally like, you know, middle tax bracket, middlingly financially stable, dog owner. You know, you could extrapolate those identities as many different ways as you can, right? Like English speaking, you know, like, well, like dual citizen, like any number of things that you could use to describe yourself. You are not any one of those things alone, right? You're a bundle of the experience of all of them. And here she kind of talks a lot about that, right? And the barriers that get thrown up in the ability for black women to get to understand themselves, and then even further with kind of the exploration of barriers to lesbianism, not just in general, but also within a black female community, which is just a fascinating essay, I think. And I particularly find it useful because it shows the kind of levels of complexity that these identities have to them that we'll be talking about, okay? Sexism, an American Disease in Blackface, despite being just a fantastic, like, title for an essay, I think, it delves more into these ideas, right? So you have that first idea, right, which is just black feminism is not white feminism and blackface. Black women have particular and legitimate issues which affect our lives as black women, and addressing those issues does not make us any less black, right? So it's an immediate description of white feminism cannot speak entirely for all feminist experience, right? But at the same time, black experience does not wholly encapsulate a feminine experience, the woman's experience. So it's definitely very interesting. It dives much more into those concepts that I was just talking about, and again is a kind of historical conception of things. This one in particular, I believe, deals a lot more with during the civil rights movement, but also just in a general societal sense, the concept of a strain between black men and black women in that context of a civil rights acquisition movement, and namely kind of the imposition then of what it means to be a black woman, not just in a greater societal and white-dominated complex, but also in the context of the black community in a civil rights context. It's very interesting, right? She has a couple other just banger quotes in this. For example, pretty early on, right? And by the way, she responds very much to, I believe this whole essay is a response, right? Yeah, so she responds to an essay that posted in the Black Scholar in 1979 by Robert Staples, so you understand who she's responding to as Staples. She originally posted it as the Great American Disease, but the essay she responded to was called "The Myth of the Black Mancha: Response to Angry Black Feminists," right? And also to a couple other, to another essay of his where it's "The Myth of the Black Matriarchy," right? So it's kind of this this unpacking of what seems to be a systemic pushback from the masculine against the feminine, under the guise of under another part of their intersectional identity. They should be unified, therefore this should be put to the side. And there should not be anger directed, for example, from black women towards the black man because they share an instance of oppression via blackness, right? So it's a very necessary essay, I think, particularly because, again, it shows the texture to how a lot of these arguments are being formed. Beyond that, it shows complexity, and it also just shows necessarily kind of the inherent deep-rootedness and how ubiquitous kind of systemic sexism can be, right? Which is obviously a large discussion that's been popularized, right? But right in this specific moment, for example, we're having a lot of good and necessary discussions of systemic racism, right? In society, and we should continue them, right? But it also, I think this gives us some really interesting insight into kind of how deep that sexism can be ingrained into kind of societal norms as well. We're on the back end of these essays now, so the next one is probably my favorite. It's the one I keep coming back to a lot now. I came out as trans earlier in the summer, right? So I'm starting to come to grips with femininity in a new way. So coming back to Lord speaking about femininity is very interesting to me in ways that it was different to me as a gay man, right? That being said, Man-Child is a fantastic essay, right? But out of all the ones that have been brought up so far, there's one line that I particularly go back to, and this is, again, probably a result of my own kind of current identity where I am in life. She has a line early in the essay, right, which is generally, by the way, about kind of what is the role of feminism in the masculine, right? Like how can we bring the tenets of what feminism really is into educating the masculine figures in our life. Here she's speaking very particularly as a black lesbian about raising a son, and she has a wonderful anecdote in there about kind of how easy it is to fall into the trap of forcing kind of that like conqueror / you must be the victor mentality onto a young male mind, right? Which is fascinating, right? And and she rightfully notes is kind of horrifying how easy it is, even for someone like Lord who speaks so much against these power structures, how easy it would be to fall into reinforcing them on our own children, right? But she's a line very early on that I keep highlighting, right, which is, our sons will not grow into women, right? So this is generally just fascinating to me. On a personal level, I've talked to a whole bunch of people about it since I came out, right? It's interesting, right, to say that maybe this is I'm interested to see what you guys think about this. This is kind of an artifact of Lord's time, right, in that she's speaking to kind of like a cis experience, cis being, non-trans in some way, right? Where, well, obviously sons grow into men and daughters grow into women, right? Or is this, just kind of for the purpose of this one discussion that she's just saying this? Lord doesn't really delve too much in, I feel, through a lot of these essays, out of the binary of gender, right? Which again, it's an interesting thing to discuss just because she is so forward-seeing on some things, but on those levels, I think she isn't quite up to the modern snuff, as it were, right? That being said, I'm interested to see what you guys think, having read through these essays. Do you think if she was still around now, would would her rhetoric on these things, how she talks about these things, have altered somewhat. I like to think so. She seems pretty plugged into things, and visionary in them in a general sense. So I think that, for example, this line might have fallen out of a later version of this essay if it was written more modernly. But for me, obviously, this is a thing that I stick with. So in a similar sense, in your discussions, I'd like to see if there's lines throughout these that any of you guys just stick in, right? That you really, really like home in on. This is really, really fascinating, right? So yeah, that one, our sons will not grow into women, very fascinating to me. It's even fascinating in modern discussion of gender, kind of gender identity and non-binariness, and then beyond that, transitioning and what the role of kind of society's imposed narrative of what that even looks like can be, right? I know plenty of trans people, myself included, who are intending to grow into women, but still recognize that, I was my parents' son, right? I did not know young, for example. So it's interesting to kind of put this in context of conversations we're having now, right? And of course, this is just an excerpt from a larger piece. It's not necessarily talking about that idea, but again, certain lines will stick with you for different reasons. So over the course of the semester, but particularly in these essays, I'd love to see the ones that you guys pick out, right? What else is in here? Good. So like beyond that, I mentioned the anecdote section about where she kind of comes to the edge of kind of chastising her son for coming and crying after fleeing from a fight. I think that's super core to this essay, and I'm really interested to hear what you guys have to say about it. And I believe we have one more essay to talk about in here. Let me pull up the reading list. Yeah, so the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, right? I'm not going to necessarily unpack this one very much for you guys, but I have a general thing that I want you to think about when it comes to discussing this, right? I want you to think about that line and the general messaging of this essay, right, in context of the current protests that are going on against police violence and systemic racism here in the United States. The news might suggest otherwise. They have not stopped since they flared up around George Floyd's killing, which is a good thing that they haven't stopped. There's still momentum. The momentum keeps coming back, right? And you will see a lot of rhetoric, particularly from what would be generally referred to as like a centrist perspective of that there's an idea that there's a right way to protest, or that stop protesting and go vote, okay? Consider those two ideas, right? The imposition, right? And we can talk about in discussions later whether or not this is even real, right? That there's a right way to protest, right? Versus, and in conjunction with the idea of don't protest, just vote. Think of who pushes those messages, right? Who benefits from them, and how does this essay, "The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House," apply to that, right? Beyond kind of the general overview of what I want you to think about on that level, this essay is probably the most complex of the bunch, which is why it's good that it's the last one I ask you to read. But I do think this is the one that when I come back to it, like especially nowadays, it's just like, oh, okay, Lord really was speaking to what we'd like to think is something as being very prescient, but the reality of it is it's just something that is continuously repetitive, which is tragic, obviously. So it's very interesting to kind of put this essay in context of what's going on now. So if you can take some time in your discussions to kind of unpack that, by all means, please do so. We will be talking about these essays multiple times throughout the semester, right? There will be some times where I might ask you to come back to this book and like read one more out of it. Particularly our next reading, which will be Claudia Rankine's Citizen, which is just an excellent, excellent book. Will deal with a lot of issues that are that brush up against what Lord's talking about here. So I wanted us to get through Lord to build a neat baseline of thinking, right? And sort of the ideas that will be coming up a lot throughout the semester, and then we'll unpack, right? That's a general thing you can also think about for your discussions, right? And more back to the idea of kind of identity and permissions is how does, Lord speaking about these things, how does that affect the ability to talk about them? Is someone like Lord coming out and publishing these essays and getting out in the kind of in the academic space in front of other activists and putting forth her ideas, does it make it easier for people after her to come and talk about it, or harder, right? These are things that I want you guys to talk about and to think about actively as we go through. But with that being said, take the time with the discussions, right? Freeform them as much as you want. You can break them down essay by essay if you want to, and take the time to respond to one or two of each other's as well, just so we can have some back and forth thinking about it. Remember, we're dealing with very difficult subject matter in the sense that it requires a sense of reasoned sensibility, right? Think about the way that you're talking to each other, right? We're part of a community and we want the best for each other. So just think about the way that you phrase things, right? Especially over text, it's a little easier in class if we kind of had that benefit of non-COVID times to have a vocal discussion, but sometimes some things can get lost in text. Things can come off a little more brutal than you intend. So just keep that in mind, okay? Those discussions will be due by like 11:59 p.m. A week from today. So that would be before the 8th of September. Those must be up and turned in, including your responses. All right. So take care, stay healthy, and be safe. And I will be in touch via email. Thank you very much.